Hi guys. First of all, my apologies if there's quite a bit of noise on the recording. I decided to come out today down to a secret and deserted beach and find a place where I can hear the waves. It's very relaxing. After several weeks in the trenches dealing with a lot of production and cybersecurity issues. I don't know if you guys are aware or how much this is common knowledge, but we're actually under a fairly sustained attack at the moment in cybersecurity. During the pandemic, a lot of our enemies have decided to take advantage of this period of weakness. So as well as the rest of the normal shit show, there's also cyber attacks on the supply chain and, believe it or not, on hospitals. The NHS is actually under attack again. How about a shout for all the frontline workers that you don't see wearing face masks and actually in public-facing conditions? There's a lot of people working very hard to keep things functioning behind the scenes in the telecommunications and in cyber defence. Okay, so today I'm going to speak to Daniel James's question, which he's asked Kate and I to have a look at, and one that he feels was systematically ignored by the bioethics conference. I think it was ignored principally because it's just too hard. It's a difficult question. It's certainly not a question that fits into a soundbite culture. And perhaps to criticise Daniel a little bit, I do think it's a bit of a loaded question. There's a lot to unpack from this. And so actually what I'm going to do is unpack the question into several smaller chunks and then address each one of these and see whether I can connect that together at the end. The first would have to be whether or not tests for the COVID virus are really difficult to conduct, if they are expensive, and whether or not we can expect to have cheap and widely available testing, the kind of thing that you'd buy from a pharmacy in a fairly short timescale. Now, obviously, I'm not a biochemist, but it does seem entirely plausible that kits costing about £10 that could be used by any ordinary person should in principle be something that you could manufacture and have widely available. The temptation then to think that what is blocking this is in fact the big pharma, the big drug companies and their patent portfolios and their general unwillingness to participate in the production of such products. And that may be completely unfair. I really don't know much about that. So I'm going to go forward under the assumption that cheap practical testing is indeed possible and should be available within 6 months to a year. The question then remains about the use of digital certificates of some kind to certify whether or not somebody is tested positive for the virus and whether or not it's practical and ethical to use those for managing return to work. I think this problem's made difficult by the fact that really only about 20% of the general public are aware of what those of us who work in security engineering, cybersecurity and hacking see as a problem is really understood. I'm going to use Joel's term techno-fascism because I think techno-fascism is great. I know it's a problematic kind of phrase. I think techno-fascism really nails it, so I'm going to just stick with that. We know who the techno-fascists are, I guess. About 3 years ago now, The Economist kicked off with an issue on what they dubbed the techlash. Some people have decided to see the techlash as some kind of neo-Luddite movement. I don't think that could be further from the truth. I think that the techlash is this growing awareness of the big problems that we have with Silicon Valley, with certain mindsets and thinking within the technology industry. The movement there is towards extremely dehumanizing technologies of cybernetic governance, of tracking and monitoring everything, of psychological manipulation and constant tie-ins with marketing and political influence. And well, look, let me put it this way. It's one of the reasons I have on the reading list for my cybersecurity and my security engineering students, Black's IBM and the Holocaust. It's really essential reading, and one of the points that we look at is the opening scene from Schindler's List. If you ask people to recall the opening scenes of Schindler's List, they'll come up with something like children being shot by Nazis, and of course it's nothing like that. The opening scene of Schindler's List is actually an official sitting at a table with a little bottle of ink, and he's asking a line of people for their names. And so IBM and the Holocaust is an essential text to read to understand the relationship between data gathering, between enforced identity, to abuse and to marginalization and ultimately to events like the Holocaust. So, yeah, let's suppose these digital certificates are viable and secure, which I'm shortly going to argue that they're not at all. But let's suppose for a moment that they are. And that they do give utility and function as a way to ease in relaxation of quarantine. What many people may be missing is that technology companies, once they've gained some ground, never, ever give it up. And the same pretty much goes for governments, although governments change and will move in a different direction. But there's always a ratcheting effect. Once you've established a framework or an application and you have digital certificates which allow social privileges and social permissions in a way that kind of goes beyond tickets and payment tokens that we already have, these frameworks will never be rescinded. They will be continually added to. You may have a digital certificate that shows that you have tested positive for COVID antibodies. Once that's commonplace and people have accepted it, in a few years' time, you'll have the same certificate prohibiting you from working in the food industry because you once had salmonella, or prohibiting you from ever driving a taxi because you once had too many speeding tickets. It circumvents the criminal justice system and it creates a parallel punitive system which does not allow justice to be done. If you study jurisprudence, you come to understand that there are many functions of a justice system, but one of them is to get people to rehabilitate and move on with their lives. The idea of a permanent record, as Edward Snowden puts it, is utterly dystopian and against all Enlightenment liberal values. So this ratcheting effect is a real problem. And one of the things that we need to do, an assurance that we need to be able to make, is that any scheme like that is temporary and reversible and is, most importantly, elective. It's something which people are not coerced or forced into doing. Now, I want to speak to that point right now. Here's something I think is remarkable, and it's something that the British people should be amazingly proud of. Look at the difference between how things are unfolding in Britain and in the US. From what I've seen, compliance and cooperation with social distancing has been pretty much universal. It's been right from the get-go. People have got it. And not only are 99% of people socially distancing really well and they're doing it in a sensible, practical way and with dignity and with politeness. You see people, for the most part, nodding and waving at each other in the street and passing by and being considerate to the body space and proximity of others. I think it makes me really happy and proud to see that. There have been a few cases of overzealous policing. There was some ridiculous incident where the police poured dye into a beauty spot in the north of England. I think they were complete idiots, and it shows a bitter and authoritarian war against nature. It seems actually nature's doing rather well at the moment. Now contrast that with what's happening in the States. This is classic utilitarian philosophy. Stateside, you have something which looks a lot like Mill's philosophy, a different flavour of utilitarianism. And over here in Britain, we have something that looks a lot more like Bentham's kind of utilitarianism. What makes the Mill's interpretation, and it's one which I really support, to be honest, it's much more my philosophy, how that's going wrong in America is people need to make informed decisions. And the Americans are subject to so much disinformation, and the internet really is a sewer of disinformation. And there are so many actors engaged in malinfluence for their own profit. So I hate to say it, but Americans do seem largely ignorant of the science and the logic around infection control, percolation models, and why quarantine works. This idea that it's my body and I can choose to be infected if I want is, obviously it's selfish, but it completely misses the point that you're not doing it on your own account. You're not doing it for you. You're isolating for the good of others. And so we see this bizarre juxtaposition in the States now where the kind of commentators who are saying, hey, it's my body, I should be able to get infected with COVID virus if I want to, they're the same people who are anti-abortionists. They're the same people who want to tell a woman what she can and can't do with her own body. And even funnier, many of them are the kind of preppy, survivalist types who have a cache of Armalite rifles and 6 months of food supplies in their garage, but their life goes to shit as soon as they can't get a haircut and they're demanding to be allowed to go out and do that. So looking at utility, the question is there really utility in social distancing? Is it working? The answer is very much an obvious yes. I don't think that that's I don't see how that can be controversial. I don't see how anyone can have so little mathematical and logical sense as not to see that disrupting the propagation of a virus by keeping away from other people is highly effective. So the situation that we're in now is that governments want to remove the lockdown as quickly as possible to save this abstract idea of the economy. I don't actually know what an economy is. I'm not an economist, but I am aware that we call it economics and not economology. I mean, it's not a science, right? Economics is elevated to far too high a station, in my opinion. And if it's not the sum total of human welfare, then what exactly is it? Looking at the way that nature is recovering at the moment, we have clear skies at night, we have air that you can breathe, we have peace and quiet, there are bees and butterflies back in the fields. It's kind of tempting to think that the economy is the enemy. So it seems there are two quite dangerous extreme positions here. The first is that the economy is the most important thing, and regardless of the consequences, we need to rush back to the life that we had 6 months ago. And I think that's the general thrust in the US now. Trump is pretty much a COVID denier, if you like. The other dangerous position is one that comes of, I think, a justified realization that many of the things that we call the economy are in fact the causes of the predicament that we're in right now. Unsustainable way of life, overcrowding, the poor housing, domination by corporations, and a work ethic which is just unproductive, make work, people rushing around in cars needlessly all the time. I think many people are holding out a hope that this event is not just a wake-up call, but precipitates genuinely good change in the way that we all live our lives. The tragedy will be if in 6 months' time we're all back to being crammed onto buses and tubes and stressed about working, competing with each other for status instead of building communities of mutual help, and many of the good things that are happening now as a result of this crisis. And taken to an extreme, there's going to be a contingent of people who basically say, fuck the economy, fuck the economy. What is this thing you call the economy if not a system that just benefits the rich 0.1% at the expense of everybody else on the planet? Fuck it. Let it collapse, let it burn, let it fall down. There will be a cult of people who see this as kind of nature's revenge and so on. I think that's a very dangerous mindset too, because although there are grains of truth in that, it's a bit like seeing that your rose garden is strewn with weeds and going to the shed and fetching a flamethrower. The more important question is, sure, there are things that we know are wrong. There are things that we know are unsustainable and we can't break out of them. So which bits of the economy are we prepared to let die? Which bits of the economy can we let fail? And though that may bring short-term hardships, the long-term gains are obviously going to be much better. And the great danger that we're discussing here today is, rather than those dangerous and damaging aspects of the economy which ought to be buried, disappearing and failing, that they're going to go from strength to strength. Most of the anti-humanist, techno-fascist technology companies right now are absolutely rubbing their hands together. They're loving this. They're enjoying an enormous land grab, further erodes privacy, dignity, and people's control over their own lives. And not just with companies like Zoom trading data to Facebook. But notice that companies like Google are immediately behind initiatives to things which are potentially abusive and fascist, very quick to support ideas which are potentially a threat to human rights. Another really important question is about alternatives. When all that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. A lot of digital technology is just solutions looking for a problem. And whenever something happens, whenever a new human need arises, there are millions of people around the world and massive industries whose interests are served by offering technological solutions. We immediately say, hey, isn't there an app for that? Isn't there something that our smartphones could do to solve that problem? And sometimes there is, but very often that's completely the wrong approach. And so why the hell would you need digital technology to solve a problem like certifying your status as somebody with a particular health condition or so on? An ordinary paper note from your doctor signed by a GP should be absolutely sufficient. Now, why? Let's think about this, because where people go wrong with technology is they misunderstand incentives. As I said before, the British people are doing an outstanding job of electively cooperating with social distancing. People really get that it's in their interests to do so. A digital certificate only becomes necessary where there is no trust and no incentive for people to cooperate. A digital certificate is essentially a status which is foisted upon you. It's other regarding. It's not information that you carry for and about yourself and willingly cooperate to give up because it's in your interests to do so. What kind of an idiot who didn't have COVID antibodies would want to go back to work? Well, only somebody who's in a precarious economic situation, which is how we got into this mess in the first place. Remember my comments about the Beecham's cold and flu advert for the 90s and how that whole macho pissing contest based on a kind of distorted Protestant work ethic just inclined people to go into the office and infect all their co-workers while trying to mask their symptoms. Well, that's all that digital certificates are going to do. Working now under the assumption that they're not secure, working under the assumption that these things are probably going to be easily forgeable, right? Or transferable or modifiable in some way. I mean, look, people are going to hack this stuff, and the people who are going to hack it are the people who have the resources. All you do with a technology like this is create more division and more privilege for the haves and less opportunity for the have-nots. And let's be perfectly honest about privilege for a moment. One of the biggest problems, one of the things that the British should be ashamed of, not proud, is that all of our airports are still open to private jets. There was an article in the Times last week. Rich people are flocking to Britain. They're moving in and out of the borders with impunity, without isolation or quarantine, just because they have money. There's one set of rules for ordinary people and a completely different set of rules for the rich. Well, what makes you think that that's not going to apply to any other kind of digital measures to control the virus? Corruption and understanding corruption is absolutely essential to security engineering. And we can't really discuss an idea like digital certificates allowing people a staged return to work without thinking about corruption and the long-term consequences of ideas like that. So those of you who are old enough to remember segregation in the US, and even those my age who remember apartheid in South Africa and how the world really united to drive out the South African regime that supported apartheid. Well, you know, there are many aspects of new digital technologies which are almost certain to create new forms of apartheid and segregation, unless we fight back against companies like Facebook and Google and Apple, unless we break down their monopolies and challenge their projects of cybernetic governance and psychological control of people. What we're going to end up with is a new kind of division. And what I say to my cybersecurity students is that what we'll see in the future is, well, classic models of division are always based on economic ideas. And we often group people into two camps of the haves and the have-nots. Those people who have access to something and those people who, for some reason, don't have access to it, but they would like access to it. And I say that there will be a completely different kind of division in the future. The world will be broken into the will and the will-nots. The world will be broken into a group of people who sacrifice willingly their privacy, their dignity, and their humanity to obtain certain economic privileges. And another group of people who value non-monetary, or basically who have a different motivational and reward structure. People who value different things in life. And they will be the will-nots. They will be the people like me who will not carry a cell phone. I will never have a cell phone. I've got by for kind of 30 years without it. Well, that's not true. I will never have a smartphone, the kind of ubiquitous all-in-one tracking device that people carry around now. I think they're disgusting instruments and cause a lot of problems in society. People like me who will never carry a smartphone and will go to prison before being coerced into carrying a always-on tracking device and surveillance device will be effectively excluded from large parts of modern society, and willingly. And I think people who think this way, you know, it's time to pick your side now. I think it's time to make those decisions and have your voice heard, and to do so in a rational way. It's not to reject any technologies as a Luddite, but to celebrate those technologies which have real utilitarian, real humanist benefit for mankind, and are not forms of fascism by the back door. I grew up in a village with people in the early 1970s as a kid who had lived not just in one war, but had fought in two wars. And I heard so many stories about sacrifice and about human values and about doing the right thing, about standing up for what you believe in, and about fighting fascists and authoritarians in kind of whatever form they are. Most of those people are dead now. And we have the same danger for Holocaust. Most of the people who were in the camps are dying or dead now. There's no first-hand information for young people to really understand the dangers of fascism and the cost of fighting it. So my moral arithmetic is that the Second World War, you know, we lost 50 million people driving back authoritarianism and fascism. What should be the cost that we're prepared to take to avoid allowing fascism in through the back door? I think my grandparents' generation would have accepted a lot more, and I think that we should too. Just as war brings out the worst in people, you know, it also brings out the best in people. And we've seen that during the COVID crisis. You do see selfish behaviour. You do see people who panic and put themselves first. You do see people who just flout the rules and put themselves above the law. But you see a lot more people who are building communities, who are helping each other out, cooking meals, looking after their neighbours, volunteering to pick up litter, doing maintenance in their community for no money. So I think there's a great opportunity here for those of us that want to promote more humanistic uses of technology, to get our ideas across, to raise public awareness of the grave dangers of techno-fascist projects and technologies which disable and take away your freedoms and dignities, and to promote alternatives like those from the free open source software movement, products like Jitsi in place of Zoom, and the many free tools that there are for video and audio production so that you can work from home without having to use corporate software, without having to use proprietary software, and tools that compromise your privacy and freedom. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to raise the level of debate about these technologies in society. The Economist's formulation of the techlash, although I read The Economist and I like it, was honestly a bit one-dimensional, I think. I don't think we've yet really examined the complexity of this debate and the issues that people are having with technology. I don't think we've really started to think about how we can build alternatives to companies like Google, to Facebook and Microsoft and Apple, Amazon. But this crisis is bringing the problems with them into sharper relief, and that's a good thing. So in bringing my comments to a close, just in the last couple of days, while I've been recording these comments, there have been a couple of interesting developments and news articles. The first is that the WHO have pretty much said no to the idea of immunity passports. And this is very, very interesting and a little bit scary. Well, it certainly changes the world that we live in. My understanding of the COVID virus had been that, like other influenza viruses, you could obtain immunity. And although that is partly or even largely true, it's not wholly true. And from the reading that I have done, I now understand that coronaviruses are something that you can catch and be infectious and build antibodies for and recover from, but then catch it again and still go through all of the stages of infection, including being an infectious carrier for it. Now, that's really different from our understanding of normal influenza viruses, which we can have vaccines for. But the World Health Organization have, I think, tried to explain the best science that we have on this and to make it clear to governments and tech corporations that the idea of digital certificates and even applications that trace proximity and contact are really quite limited. And so I suspect at the moment that those who are pressing ahead with these ideas at the moment are doing so for private economic interests, rather than genuinely thinking about what is a good measure. And in Daniel's case, which concerns the Isle of Wight, I think that he's very right that councillors there are lobbying for technologically mediated privilege to satisfy those wealthy second home owners who want to push for an early lifting of restrictions. And pressure is rather obviously being increased by all of those who have private economic concerns. This week, the Times newspaper carried the headline that Tory grandees were pushing the government towards an early end to the lockdown. Well, I had to think about that. What are Tory grandees? Well, I don't know. I think that that's just code for rich industrialists. And so we have a government that's under great pressure to lift restrictions early for economic reasons, and a snake oil technological mechanism for making that seem okay, despite that the WHO have said that that's nonsense. And so the stage is set for another push by the techno-fascists, whose interests are very much aligned with other parts of the corporate world, to, as they would say, get the economy moving again by sneaking in technological measures to restrict freedom and human rights.